Right now, at this very moment, you believe certain things about the world. You believe them because you saw them on the news. You read them in a newspaper. You heard them from a journalist you trusted. But what if I told you that for decades, starting in the late 1940s and running well into the 1970s, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States had secret employees sitting inside America's biggest newsrooms, not watching, not monitoring, writing. This wasn't a theory whispered on the internet. This was a real, funded, classified CIA operation. It had a name. It had a budget. It had hundreds of journalists on the payroll at outlets like CBS, the New York Times, Newsweek, Time magazine, and the Associated Press. They called it Operation Mockingbird. And the reason most Americans have never heard of it is exactly the point. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you are going to look at every headline you read, every news broadcast you watch, completely differently, and you are never going to be able to undo that. Welcome back to ForbiddenRecords. If you are new here, this is the channel that reads the files they sealed, declassifies the history they buried, and tells you the stories that powerful people spent billions making sure you would never hear. Subscribe if you haven't, and turn on notifications, because what we cover here, the algorithm does not always like. Now, let's open the file on Operation Mockingbird. To understand Operation Mockingbird, you have to understand the moment it was born. The year is 1947. World War II has been over for 2 years. America won. But instead of peace, a new kind of terror had arrived. The Cold War, the Soviet Union now had nuclear ambitions. Communist ideology was spreading across Europe and Asia, and inside Washington, D.C. A deep, suffocating paranoia had taken hold. American intelligence officials believed the Soviets were waging something more dangerous than a military war. They believed the real battleground was the mind. Soviet propaganda was sophisticated, well-funded, and global. They were flooding countries with pro-communist messaging through newspapers, radio, film, and word of mouth. The CIA's conclusion was chilling. If the Soviets could control what people believed, they could take over countries without firing a single bullet. And so the CIA decided to fight back, using the exact same weapon. The man who built that weapon was a man named Frank Wisner, a Mississippi-born lawyer who had served in the OSS, the wartime predecessor to the CIA, by 1948. Wisner was running a covert division inside the CIA called the Office of Policy Coordination. Its mission was simple and terrifying: wage psychological warfare against America's enemies. But here is where it gets dark. The enemies Wisner had in mind weren't just overseas. What I'm about to tell you next is the part that every journalism school in America refuses to put in its curriculum. Keep watching. Frank Wisner had a vision. He called it his mighty Wurlitzer, like a massive pipe organ that could play any tune he wanted, in any country, at any time. The instrument he would play was the American press. Starting in the late 1940s, the CIA began quietly recruiting journalists, not fringe writers, not small-town reporters. The CIA went straight to the top. They approached editors and correspondents at the most powerful media organizations in the United States: CBS, News, Time magazine, Newsweek, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Miami News, Reuters, the Associated Press. Some journalists were paid directly. Some were given overseas assignments that the CIA funded secretly. Some were simply asked to kill certain stories, to bury them before they ever reached the public. And in exchange, they received access, money, career advancement, and protection. By the mid-1950s, according to later congressional testimony, the CIA had over 400 American journalists on its payroll. 400. At the peak of the operation, the CIA owned or had significant influence over more than 25 newspapers and wire services, and had relationships with at least 400 journalists who would write what the agency needed written. Think about what that means. If you were an American in 1955, sitting at your kitchen table reading your morning newspaper, there was a real possibility that the story on the front page had been planted, shaped, or approved by an intelligence agency, not a foreign one. Your own. The stories they pushed weren't random. They were strategic. The CIA used its media network to build public support for foreign coups it was secretly orchestrating. In Iran in 1953, in Guatemala in 1954, they used it to discredit politicians they considered threats. They used it to manufacture fear about communism at home, which gave them more budget and more power. It was a perfect machine, and it ran in total silence for nearly 30 years. Now, let's get specific, because this is where history textbooks go completely silent. One of the most prominent figures connected to Operation Mockingbird was Joseph Alsop, one of the most widely read political columnists in America during the 1950s and 60s. His column ran in over 300 newspapers. He had direct access to presidents, and according to declassified CIA documents, he was also cooperating with the CIA, writing columns that aligned with and advanced agency objectives. Another name, Cord Meyer, a Yale-educated war veteran who became a senior CIA officer and was one of the key architects of Operation Mockingbird. He personally managed relationships with journalists and oversaw which stories were placed in which outlets. Then there was Philip Graham. Publisher of the Washington Post, Graham reportedly told a gathering of journalists that the operation was so widespread that it was not possible to keep it secret. He understood the full scope of what the CIA had built inside American media. He died in 1963 under circumstances his family always considered suspicious. And there was the international arm. The CIA didn't stop at American borders. Using front organizations and secretly funded magazines, they spread their messaging globally. Radio Free Europe, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, publications across Western Europe that appeared to be independent voices of freedom, but were funded entirely by CIA money channeled through fake foundations. The operation was so sophisticated that most of the journalists involved didn't fully understand the scope of what they were part of. Some genuinely believed they were serving their country. Others knew exactly what they were doing and didn't care. The result was the same either way. The American public was being managed, carefully, professionally, invisibly. Here is the part that should make every single one of you angry, and I mean genuinely, deeply angry. Because what happened next is worse than the operation itself. For nearly 30 years, Operation Mockingbird was airtight. Nobody talked, nobody leaked. The machine kept running. Then came 1975. In the aftermath of Watergate, the American public's trust in government had collapsed. Congress, for the first time in decades, had the political will to actually investigate the CIA. Senator Frank Church of Idaho formed what became known as the Church Committee, a Senate Select Committee tasked with investigating abuses of power by American intelligence agencies. What they found changed everything. The committee uncovered the existence of Operation Mockingbird. They found evidence of the CIA's financial relationships with journalists. They documented how the agency had used the press to plant stories, shape public opinion, and cover up its own operations. CIA Director William Colby, testifying before Congress, confirmed the agency had worked with journalists. He tried to minimize the scope, but the documents told a different story. Congressional investigators found that the CIA's media operation was so embedded in American journalism that simply removing all agency assets from newsrooms would have caused visible gaps, missing bylines, sudden reassignments, stories that had been quietly supported suddenly losing their placement. The findings were explosive. The hearings were televised. For a brief moment, Americans stared directly at the truth of what had been done to them. And then, almost nothing happened. The CIA promised to reform. They said they would stop using American journalists as assets. In 1976, CIA Director George H.W. Bush, yes, The man who later became President of the United States announced the agency would no longer knowingly recruit journalists working for American news organizations. Notice the word knowingly. It does all the work in that sentence. No one was prosecuted. No journalist lost their job. No media organization ran a full accounting of its own cooperation with the CIA. The story faded from front pages within weeks, almost as if someone decided it shouldn't stay there too long. Here is the uncomfortable question that every researcher who has studied Operation Mockingbird eventually arrives at. Did it stop? The CIA said yes. George Bush drew the line in 1976. Official policy changed. On paper. But consider this. The Church Committee's final report noted that the CIA had so thoroughly embedded itself in American media that a complete accounting of all relationships was impossible because many were conducted verbally, with no paper trail, no documents, no payments on record, just a phone call, a quiet conversation, a favor. In 1977, 1 year after the CIA's promise to reform, journalist Carl Bernstein, one of the two reporters who broke the Watergate story, published a 25,000-word investigation in Rolling Stone magazine. He had spent months interviewing former CIA officials, journalists, and congressional investigators. His conclusion: the CIA's use of the American press was far more extensive than the Church Committee had revealed, and the reforms, in his assessment, were largely cosmetic. In 1997, the CIA declassified a portion of its internal history of Operation Mockingbird. Even the sanitized version confirmed the basic facts. The operation was real. The scope was vast. The targets included American citizens, the very people the CIA is legally prohibited from operating against on domestic soil. And here is what we know for certain today. The CIA still has what it calls relationships with media organizations and individuals around the world. That is publicly acknowledged. The line between a foreign media relationship and a domestic one, in the age of global, digital news, is thinner than it has ever been. We cannot prove Operation Mockingbird is still running. We also cannot prove it isn't. What we can prove with declassified documents, congressional testimony, and the CIA's own internal records is that it happened for at least 30 years. At the highest levels of American journalism, with the full knowledge and direction of the United States government. So here is my question for you, and I want you to actually think about this before you answer in the comments. If the CIA was willing to do this for 30 years without anyone finding out, what does that change about the way you consume the news today? Operation Mockingbird is not a conspiracy theory. It is a documented, confirmed, declassified program of the United States government. The files exist. The congressional testimony exists. The names are on record. The CIA built a machine that decided what America believed. And for 30 years, it worked perfectly, because they understood something profound about human nature. People don't question the news, they just absorb it. And that is exactly why channels like ForbiddenRecords exist. Not to tell you what to think, but to make sure you have the information to think for yourself with the full picture, not the managed one. If this video gave you something real, share it, because the best thing you can do right now is put this information in front of someone who has never heard the name. Operation Mockingbird. Subscribe if you haven't already. Every week, we open another file they sealed. The next one is going to hit even harder than this. I'll see you there.